Hi, this is Chris Pearson, President of 5G Americas, and welcome to the 5G Americas podcast series on understanding 5G. Today, we are privileged to have the Honorable Brendan Carr, Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. Welcome, Commissioner Carr.
Oh, great to join you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're so fortunate to have you today, and we're looking forward to the discussion. As our new tradition in our video podcast, we start out with having our guests just answer a few personal questions so that our audience can get a chance to know you a little bit better before we kind of get down to the real business at hand. So you're prepared for those personal questions?
Hopefully. Let's see how it goes.
All right, sounds good. Tell us something about yourself that most in the wireless industry don't know about you.
Well, one thing that you probably don't know and is somewhat relevant is I'm afraid of heights, which probably seems a bit odd because every time I travel outside of DC, I try to spend time with tower crews up a broadcast tower or a cell site somewhere. So I've been 2,000 feet up above Rowena, South Dakota. I've been 1,700 feet up above Central Florida. I've been a couple hundred feet up above the Hoover Dam out in Nevada. So I've always enjoyed those, but I truly don't like heights, and people find that sort of hard to believe, but you kind of just got to compartmentalize it, put that piece to the side and focus on what's in front of you.
And I've seen some of those pictures on those cell towers with you. So you're doing a great job of showcasing that you can overcome that fear. All right, next question. What is your favorite passion outside of work?
Well, the thing that takes up the lion's share of my time, and thankfully I love it, is my kids. I've got a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and an 18-month-old back home. And so spending the last year plus in mostly COVID lockdown with them and my wife has been interesting. We have a little 2-bedroom condo that we've been living in, so it's been tight spaces. But my 3 boys obviously are going to be the big passion. They love playing sports. They love wrestling. They love almost sending each other to the emergency room. So it's a fun time. I think it'll continue to be so for quite a while.
Yeah, enjoy that time. I got twin 17-year-olds, and I can't even believe how fast.
It's true.
Now they're looking at colleges, and it's like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do next? Next is the last personal question: which talent would you most like to have if you could have it?
Well, at this stage in my life, being able to make do without sleep would be a phenomenal talent. My kids get going. If we make it to 6 a.m. without one of them getting up and starting to, play or throw something or yell around, that's pretty lucky. So usually some point in the 5 o'clock hour, they get going, and sometimes through the night they do handoffs where one will be up from 1 to 2, then the other one will take the 2 to 3 shift. So they do a pretty good job keeping us awake. So I'd love to find a way to make do on basically zero sleep, which is where we seem to be right now.
You must be drinking a lot of either Coke or coffee or things like that. Yep. Is my guess. I remember those days. All right, so let's get down to some of the serious business at hand. Really, under understanding 5G, we want to get all the thought leaders in the industry, and whether it's technology and policy. So I have some questions I want to ask you today, and the first one is, when it comes to American leadership on 5G, where do you think the U.S. stands among the world's nations, and where can we do more with that?
The good news is we're in pretty good shape at the moment. And back in 2015, 2016, we were at real serious risk of ceding U.S. leadership in wireless to our global counterparts. And analysts like Ernst & Young and Deloitte were looking at China in particular, and they said that China was about to unleash a 5G tsunami, making it near impossible for the U.S. to catch up. And the reality is they were a bit onto something back then. On the infrastructure side, it cost too much and it took too long to build the new cell sites you needed for 5G. It's just an example. What it took us 4 years to do in terms of new cell site builds in this country, China was doing every 9 days. I mean, that was the scope and scale of the infrastructure gap. On the spectrum side, similarly, they had hundreds of megahertz, not just China, but other countries, particularly the mid-band spectrum at a point in time, and we largely had zero, or at least hadn't brought any new spectrum on in quite a while. Flash forward from 2017, 18, 19, 20, we engage in a lot of work to modernize our infrastructure rules and to free up more spectrum. On the spectrum side, we freed up about 6 gigahertz of licensed spectrum plus thousands of megahertz of unlicensed spectrum. We modernized infrastructure rules, and as a result, we saw really a remarkable turnaround. So we went from 708 new cell sites built in this country in 2016 to over 46,000 new cell sites built in 2019, a 65-fold increase. So we really accelerated infrastructure builds by letting the private sector get going, and we put the spectrum out there that is going to fuel all of these 5G applications. So we really leapfrogged our global counterparts. We moved up 20 rankings in the Global Mobile Speed Index. We, established a leadership position in 5G with the strongest 5G platform in the world. So things are in really good shape, but obviously now is not the time to rest on our laurels. We got to continue down this winning path, more spectrum, more infrastructure, and obviously a workforce to build out this 5G infrastructure.
Well, yeah, you kind of answered a little bit of one of my questions, which was really, in the previous administration, you actually led that effort regarding, streamlining cell site processes and so forth. So where do you see the overall benefit has been? And you just mentioned it kind of, I guess, but I mean, have you seen like real where the rubber meets the road, that those streamlined processes are actually working out there?
Yeah, absolutely. 5G is obviously live in this country, and it's not just in places like Manhattan or San Francisco. It's live in places like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where I was about 2 weeks ago with the mayor there, seeing basically gigabit speed 5G mobile being delivered right there in South Dakota. So the infrastructure reforms that we put in place made sure that these builds happen not just in the most populous centers where the economies are going to drive builds, but across mid-sized, smaller communities as well. So I think that's a great sign of the work that we've done, and we now have a commitment, obviously, from at least one provider to build 5G to 99% of the U.S. population, and all of the carriers are launching nationwide 5G. So I think all of these are signs that the reforms that we put in place are paying off, and all that's going to be more competition. We're seeing prices decrease, internet speeds increase. So the trend lines are heading in the right direction. We're certainly not at the point where you're going to fly the mission accomplished flag just yet, but things have definitely been turned around for the good.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks to all that great work that you and the FCC is doing. You mentioned earlier in your after during my first question, and you mentioned spectrum. So I know that you have some real viewpoints, as well as various commissioners out there on the FCC, but I wanted to get your specific viewpoints on in terms of the spectrum, because it is really the oxygen for our industry. I mean, we've heard that before, and it's true. And we've seen it. We've seen it with the recent C-band auction, obviously, and how much that raised, and CBRS auction. All these, people need spectrum. What's your idea as far as your views on, what band should be prioritized now? Here we are in 2021. We can't just stop, right? We have to be thinking about what's next. So what's your ideas on or views on what band should be prioritized?
It's a good question. I put out a spectrum calendar not too long ago to walk through the bands that I think that we should prioritize, because to your point, we made a lot of progress over the last couple of years, but a lot of the work that we did on spectrum, almost all of it, none of it was really a walk in the park. And we've had a lot of interaction, obviously, with federal users, with NTIA, with DoD over the years. And there's a lot of interest right now in re-upping MOUs and collaborating, and all that's great. We've done that. We should obviously continue to do it, but the rubber's going to meet the road at some point, and that's where it really comes down to strong leadership at the FCC. And whether we like it or not, spectrum policy these days, if you're going to do the right thing for 5G builds in this country, you got to develop political capital as a leader at the FCC, and you got to be willing to spend it on spectrum. And that's going to mean some of these fights are going to bubble up into the headlines. I mean, the reason why we got 5.9 where we did in terms of additional spectrum was we were willing to make the right call, even though the Department of Transportation was going to push back, and there were going to be headlines on that. We did the same thing with millimeter wave and 28 gigahertz with NOAA. We see it in spectrum bands across the board. So we did the right thing. In terms of what's next, I think obviously first up for this year in 2021 is we need to get 3.45 auction across the finish line.
Yep.
The good news is we are, headed very much in the right direction on that, I think, with the vote we took earlier this year to tee that up for an auction later this year. The second band I think we should move on this year is 2.5 gigahertz. We still have a lot of this spectrum that we need to get out into the commercial marketplace. It's prime mid-band spectrum. We actually took the steps in January that would allow us, if we've got the fortitude to do it, to get the 2.5 auction done this year as well. I've also talked about 6 gigahertz as a third band for this year, that we should take a look at authorizing very low power in 6 gigahertz. This is interesting to me because this is going to power a lot of the AR, VR applications that are going to be a further driver for 5G use cases and purchasing a 5G phone. So I think that 6 gigahertz proceeding is going to be important. 3.5 gigahertz, CBRS, we got that spectrum out there a little while ago, but I think now is the time to look at whether we should increase the power in 3.5 and make it even more usable for 5G and cover a broader geographic area. So I think we should start a proceeding this year that seeks comment on increasing the power levels in 3.5. I've also identified some other interesting bands, what is called Uni 2C, which this is an unlicensed spectrum that technically was opened up years ago, but it's got some clunky, what I would argue is probably outdated detection systems in there to protect federal incumbents. The upshot is most manufacturers don't even include this large 255 megahertz swath of spectrum in their devices because the detection system is too cumbersome. So I think we should look at whether we can streamline the approach there and basically get spectrum that's already in the marketplace actually into commercial devices. So I think that would be a good move. I've also identified spectrum for next year for 22. At the top of our list, I think, is 1300 megahertz to 1350. This is 50 megahertz that was identified as a target for clearing back in 2015. I think we can do that. I think at that point, we'll also be ready to go on another millimeter wave band. 42 gigahertz might be the right step for that one. And I've identified a little bit further out, looking beyond 2022, some bands that we should move on. Lower 3 gigahertz should be primed for action at that point. 4.8 gigahertz is another one we could move on. Plus there's spectrum in the 7.125 to 8.4 gigahertz range. And then also, I think we're probably ready at that point after 22 to look above 95 gigahertz from some of the interesting sort of terahertz spectrum bands up there. So it's funny that the challenge in 2017 was that the spectrum covered was largely bare. We had started a lot of millimeter wave proceedings back then, and we got those across the finish line. But there's a lot of legwork to put into the spectrum pipeline, some core mid-band spectrum. We did that. Now the challenge is we got to meet that pace and the cadence that we hit the last 3 or 4 years. And there'll be some tests. 5.9 again is one where DOT is once again trying to relitigate that and try to get the FCC to reverse course. That would be a mistake. We got to, keep the wins that we've had up on the board and not take them down at this point.
So you got a lot of viewpoints and a lot of ideas about how to keep that spectrum pipeline going. Does that mean that we should be looking at, within the U.S. government, like a national spectrum plan, or should it just happen with different viewpoints going out there and then kind of the normal process that goes through the, Washington, D.C. and the different departments, or what are your thoughts? Should we have a national spectrum plan and why or why not?
There's aspects of the current approach that are broken, and so I'm open to different ideas. I think a lot of people are pointing to something as a problem with process that really isn't a process problem. Again, when you've got these sort of headline level disputes between FCC and DoD, we saw this on Legato, for instance. We see it with DOT on 5.9. We may see even more of it still in 3.45 proceeding. There's not really a different front end process or additional MOUs that you can put in place. At the end of the day, you're going to come down to incumbent federal users that have their mission, their chain of command, their priorities that they're looking out for. You've got the FCC that's taking a very broad look at how do we increase opportunities across the board for American consumers and also create networks that can be leveraged by DoD. And at the end of the day, we don't always agree. And it is incumbent on us at the FCC to make the right call. So I don't look at, Legato becoming a headline level issue with DoD or 5.9 becoming a headline issue with DOT as examples of a problem that needs a different process, I look at that as that's evidence that the FCC did the right thing, because no matter what the process is at the end of the day, if you're going to, dislodge 5.9 from an inefficient allocation to one that is, efficient across the board, both for vehicle safety and consumers, or move forward with legato, there's going to be disagreements on the federal
Mhm.
side. And there's very little ways, regardless of how much process you put in, that would have produced a different outcome in terms of the headlines there. But still the right call for the FCC.
So the FCC and how they work on some of these issues and opportunities is how I'll put them. Especially when things like Department of Defense or other agencies have their priorities and their thoughts. Is that FCC role in working with the NTIA to get that spectrum? Is that a role that is working? Then that process is okay, or should there be changes on how that would occur?
Yeah, we can certainly continue to improve the process. I mean, there's been no surprises along the way so far. I mean, we engaged for a long, long time, years on 5.9. We engaged a
Right.
long time, years on legato. So
Yep.
there was not a shortage of time or a shortage of discussion back and forth. There was just at the end of the day, a disagreement of the path forward. And we're the ones charged with making those calls and doing it based on the engineering and based on the public interest, and that's what we do. So I
Right.
think, again, I'm open to changes, but at the end of the day, we got to just, make the right calls.
Yeah. Okay, great. One of the things that's come up a lot is, this idea of, to progress, 5G and even, what I would call, my name is 5G Americas. It's beyond 5G, just continuing that idea of, hey, this technology doesn't stop. I mean, if you look at 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, it's amazing how much improvement we get every time we jump a generation, or even within a generation, how much improvement we have. Where do is there a role or not a role within the U.S. government in helping to accelerate that progress in mobile wireless communications, or 5G, when it comes to like funding, public funding of wireless research, or other areas? Is there a role for the U.S. government to be part of that wireless funding of research, or not?
There's certainly a lot of interest in that. My focus obviously has been on sort of other aspects of it, which
Right.
is, freeing up the spectrum, which is the oxygen for 5G or 6G. I think that's key. The infrastructure side, making sure that, it's easy to build these networks out here. And Congress certainly is looking at different funding initiatives, including, in some of the new infrastructure packages. One interesting piece of this is, the transition that's going on to ORAN, which I think is very interesting. I've been
Right.
interested in ways that the federal government can help assist that transition. From my perspective, where I sit sort of outside of the funding side, since we don't provide funding for those things. And I think it's an interesting phenomena where you're seeing this, unbundling of the software and hardware portions of the wireless network. And it mimics what we've seen over the years in a lot of other markets, including the home PC market. When Apple first came out, it was bundled, vertically integrated, hardware, software, expensive, too
Right.
expensive for a lot of families back in the day.
Yeah.
And then, Microsoft came in and saw an opportunity and went after the software side, and they let other businesses go after the hardware side, Dell and others. And that ended up being very much pro-consumer in terms of increased innovation on the software side, lowering of costs on the hardware side. In a lot of ways, that's what we see happening as well with ORAN. So I want to encourage that in the sense that we make sure people can make, informed decisions. I don't want to put a thumb on the scale for ORAN as a technology. At the end of the day, we want consumers, through the choices they make with providers, to drive these types of decisions. But I do think we can be supportive at the federal level with respect to that transition. The other interesting thing about ORAN is it can drive down a lot of the costs for network infrastructure. So rather than needing to stand up a $15-20 billion R&D facility to build network gear, you can compete at the software level through coding that plays to an enduring American strength. So we have a lot of U.S. providers that can now compete in the network space through ORAN potentially.
Right. Right. And you talked about an enduring strength, and one of the things that I would say is one of the enduring strengths of mobile wireless communications is security, and it's really in our DNA as mobile wireless operators and vendors and so forth. But is there areas where the United States federal government, we've seen the headlines, as you'd say about other things, but we've seen these headlines about security breaches, security attacks, or attacks, excuse me, on software, or obviously recently the Colonial Pipeline, things like that. Is there a role for the federal government when it comes to security for wireless cellular technology or areas, or even 5G networks? Again, it's in our blood, but is there a role also for the federal government to play in that improvement of 5G network security?
There certainly is and should be, although the one risk that we need to be aware of is getting too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, we had this process where DHS, which was the sector-specific lead for cybersecurity for a lot of the telecom industry, was working well and collaboratively with industry. And on the other hand, you then had the FCC trying to stand up its own parallel regime. And I thought that was a mistake. I think what we needed to do back then, and increasingly, is center this work at DHS with the sort of broad cyber specialist there. And then the FCC has a seat at that table, bringing our network expertise to bear. And I think collaborating together through that process is far more productive and efficient than standing up sort of a lot of parallel regimes across different agencies. So I think that's one thing that I'm going to be looking to continue to move towards, is collaboration through the DHS process.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so I want to move to a couple of broader questions. We've seen during this COVID-19 pandemic, obviously a lot of challenges, a lot of really interesting, almost a real life experience about moving to remote education, remote work, all these types of areas that were kind of forced upon us by the pandemic. When you think about the United States, and you also think about all the citizens, the entire kind of ecosystem of citizens that need to be connected, is there a role for the government to work to close that digital divide, so that all the citizens have a better opportunity to stay connected, which we've seen is probably the number one application in the pandemic, is being connected? Is there a role, and what should the U.S. be doing?
Yeah, as stay-at-home orders washed across the country, Americans increasingly turn to the internet to recreate their daily routines. To your point, educating kids, working from home, telehealth, education. I mean, Netflix traffic almost overnight spiked 50% in this country as people turned to the internet for everything. And there's a lot of interest right now in DC in further closing the digital divide. I would say, one, the policies we've put in place are working. The digital divide is closing with all these new infrastructure builds, all this spectrum going up. So we should continue down that path. But Congress is looking at various proposals. I think Democrats have put out a $100 billion broadband plan. Republicans have countered with a $60 billion plan. First and foremost is we need to get funding out the door at the FCC, right? So we've got $40 billion roughly that's sitting here that we've either budgeted or voted on and haven't spent yet. So we need to get that 40 out the door, administer that, get Americans across the digital divide with that 40. Then let's take stock of where we are and put additional investment in on top of that that's needed to get the job done. So I think that's one thing that we can do. The other piece of this is mapping. We need to complete our broadband maps, and that will help us target the funding and identify the areas that still have 0 or 1 megabit per second and direct our resources there, and that'll be very efficient. I've called for earlier this year the FCC to get the maps done by this fall. There's been some inconsistent information provided by others on the FCC since then. On the one hand, there was a statement that indicated that the maps will be done by this July, which would be great. On the other hand, there's been a statement that the maps won't be done till next year. I think we got to do some cleanup there and provide some certainty when those maps are going to be done, because that's going to be the driver for when we can start the 5G fund, when we can start RDOF2, and a lot of other initiatives that are going to fully bridge the digital divide. So yeah, there's certainly a very, very strong role for us to play in getting the job done in terms of making sure there's access and affordability across the board.
That's great. Important. I mean, whether it's during times of pandemic or just any time, that idea of connectivity for all and working toward bridging that digital divide. Coming up to the end of this video podcast, and really appreciate your time, but I want to get your thoughts. You've been at the forefront of, I've seen several of your speeches about the impact of 5G and the 5G industry and so forth on the American economy and American job growth. Could you provide us a little insight or thoughts about the importance of 5G and the economy?
Yeah, I think the build out of 5G infrastructure is one of the great success stories of the past 3 or 4 years, and it creates jobs up and down the economy. I mean, a lot of us think about the coding jobs, the jobs in sort of AR and VR. They're going to be enabled from this build out of the network. But I've also tried to highlight the great jobs that are created right along the way as you build it out. So we have about 27,000 tower climbers in this country. We need to increase by 20,000 the number of tower climbers. Those are good paying jobs. You can start with virtually no experience, make $55,000, $60,000 with a couple weeks training, very quickly move into six figures from there. A lot of the owners of these companies started as climbers themselves before getting into that business. And then small town manufacturing. I've visited a lot of small town manufacturings that are increasingly leveraging connectivity to increase their productivity. Precision ag is a really burgeoning and continuing to grow in terms of increasing productivity. So 5G networks are a great job story, from the construction to the coding, AR, VR, all across the board. It's a great story for our economy.
Yeah, and I think that's some great concluding remarks there. So, Commissioner Carr, I would just like to say thank you so much for spending time with our audience today to learn more about yourself, learn about your viewpoints on where we're going with 5G. And again, just a big thank you for all that you're doing for the United States of America as a commissioner. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
All right. Have a great day.